Good morning. Today we are going to be having a conversation with Emeritus Professor Robin Poynor. Poynor grew up in Louisiana and earned a bachelor's degree from Southeastern Louisiana University and proceeded from there to the San Francisco Art Institute to study BFA in studio art before he then turned his attention to the study of art and the context of culture. Having earned the MA and PhD degrees in art history at Indiana University, Poynor has researched the art of Africa for the past 40 years. He has conducted extensive fieldwork in Nigeria and Sierra Leone, and he has devoted a lot of his research energy, writing articles and publishing materials regarding the arts of Africa. His work presently focuses on the arts of the African diaspora, especially as it relates to the manifestations of Yoruba culture in the American South. Good morning, Dr. Poynor.
Good morning. How are you?
I am very well. How are you doing?
Doing well, thank you.
Yeah, I hope Florida is keeping it together in the face of this ongoing pandemic.
Well, I guess we're dealing like every other place. I was just looking at what the Harn Museum was doing as far as getting African art out on the web, and saw an interview between Eric Siegel and Susan Cooksey about an exhibition that was supposed to have opened, but could not open because of the coronavirus. So they're trying to do things just as you are by placing things online.
Yeah, it's beginning to look like the new normal. We're sure that at the end of the pandemic, things will not be the same, maybe for some time, because we really don't know. But that said, there's always a very yellow line under the horizon. We hope that we are going to use this online opportunity to create content that will engage museum enthusiasts and also help educate as wider audience as possible. Thank you so much for being part of this program this morning, sir. In order not to waste so much of our time, I'm just going to go straight into what we have today. And part of it is I have framed it in such a way that it's going to be like a conversation. But I know that towards the end of my graduate studies at the University of Florida in Gainesville, we had started a seminar that kind of looked at the development of the study of African art in museum institutions in the United States. And I was wondering if you can just help us do a run through, even though I know I could do that, but it would be very good for us to hear from your mouth how you think that history has actually played out in the past 50 to 60 years.
Yes. Well, it's interesting that we just had an issue of African Arts, which is the primary journal for African art studies in the United States, celebrating 50 years of its presence. And I just happened to have started graduate school in 1967 when the first issue of African Arts was published. So I've been with the discipline since that publication has started. When I started the study of the arts of Africa, most of the studies had been done by historians and anthropologists, and it really wasn't something that was delved into too deeply by art historians. As a matter of fact, I think in the Western world, in Europe and in the United States, the interest in African arts first came through artists themselves. And I think we're all familiar with the way that people like Matisse and Picasso and Braque and Vlaminck and other European artists began to be interested in the forms and what they felt as being the expressiveness of objects that had been created in Africa. And they were interested primarily in the forms and how they responded to the forms. They really weren't interested in who had produced them or why they had produced them or how they had been used in Africa and so on. That was something that anthropologists had begun to look at. So there were anthropologists in places like Belgium and France and England, the United States, who began to look at the cultures that produced African art and to delve into reasons why this art was produced, what techniques were used, how these things function as elements in leadership, in education, in religion, and all of those various ways that African art was used and why it was created. One of the American anthropologists who was very much involved in the study was Melville Herskovits at Northwestern University. And he began to look at places like Dahomey, the kingdom of Dahomey, and he also began to explore how there were retentions and continuations of African culture in the Western Hemisphere. And there was a graduate student who was in the study of art history at Iowa. His name was Roy Sieber. And Roy Sieber became interested in how African art was used and what it looked like and so on. And he actually spent a year at Northwestern, sort of at the feet of Herskovits to learn about it. And Sieber was the first art historian in the United States to earn a degree in art history with a focus on anthropology. As you said, I had done a bachelor's degree and a BFA in studio production. I began to feel that I really was not that creative. I was more academically inclined. So I began to look for a graduate school. I had also become interested in anthropology. So I wanted a place where I would be able to plug in my interest in anthropology into the study of art history. And I just happened upon Indiana University, which is where Roy Sieber was, and the ethnomusicologist Alan Merriam was working. And they had begun a very strong program in the study of African humanities there. There were also people in African folklore and in African literature. So it was sort of the ideal place for me to go to begin my studies. All in all, Sieber produced about 40 PhDs. I was in his first wave of students. And in his teaching, he emphasized the focus on the object, to look at the object in a traditional art historical way, to think in terms of its form, its materials, the techniques that were used for making it, but then to go further and to explore why this object had been made, why the artist used the techniques that he or she used in creating the object, and looking at how the object was used within the community in which it had been commissioned, why it had been commissioned, who commissioned it, and then how it functioned within the community and how it lived its life out as an object. Excuse me. That's not coronavirus, that's Florida allergies. So anyway, that was sort of the beginning of the studies of African art through art history in the United States. In Europe, it continued for a long time to be something was studied by anthropologists. But in places like Belgium and England, there were also those who took it into the realms of art history. I mentioned the fact that Sieber usually started with the object as a starting point, and then using the object as a way to enter into the community in which that object had been used. He also was very much interested in the exhibitions of objects, and all of his students were trained essentially both as art historians with an anthropological bent, but also as museum persons. So one of his students, one of his very first students, was Bill Fagley, who became the curator for the collection at the New Orleans Museum of Art. So he was one of the first of Sieber's students who went into museum practice. And so I'm sure that you are familiar with Bill, and all of the other people at the New Orleans Museum are familiar with his work and his development of the collection that you fell heir to. Others of his students have ended up at the Smithsonian. For example, Roslyn Walker became the director of the Museum of African Art at the Smithsonian. She retired from that and is now the chief curator of African art collection at the Dallas Museum of Art, and is still working. There's a definite link between the study of art history, the study of African cultures through anthropology, but also the exhibition of the arts of Africa in museums. So it's a very, there's a very close link among all of these disciplines. And you, having first trained as an artist and then training as an art historian, and having worked at the Virginia Museum of Art and now the museum in New Orleans, you're sort of picking up on all of those different elements that have been a part of the study of African art in the United States.
Wow, thank you so much for this very exciting history. Yeah, from your, oops, did you go out offline?
It says I have a low battery, but I have it plugged into a.
Maybe I'll just pause the record. Oh no, I think I'll just. Yes, you're back on now. Okay.
Am I back on?
Yes, you're back on.
I hope that can be edited out.
I believe so. Yeah, those guys in technology, they know how to fix those things. Yeah, so it is very exciting that, you know, the same kind of trajectory that you.
While we're at an editing point, let me cough and get it over with.
yeah, it is supposed to be very fluid. It's not going to be a very rigid kind of, you know, presentation. We are supposed to be in a conversation, so that's fine. Yeah, it is very exciting to see how you know, the study of African art has kind of progressed since it first came to the consciousness of, you know, the academic arena in the West. Just a very quick one. I know we have already talked about this some time ago, but I just wanted to you know, pique your mind here regarding what Roland Abiodun stated in his speech at ASA in 1990, when he wrote a speech about the state of the discipline. In that speech, he had advocated for numerous changes in the way African art material, or African art material is you know, is addressed in the West. And among the numerous things he had declared, or, you know, he had stated, I think I picked one which was very, very important. and which is what we are also currently grappling with today. And in that, he had declared that the language of the culture should be inserted into any discussion regarding the material. I know too that, beyond the language, we are also dealing with a very unique type of material in various African art objects. So from your perspective, or, from what you have seen coming until this day, do you think that museum institutions, especially in America, have done a good job, taking that advice on board?
Well, of course, for museums, the use of language is not something that's very easily done. You cannot expect that the museum viewer is going to be able to pick up the 2,000 or so different languages that are used on the language. I think what Roland Abiodun was expressing had to do with the research that went into the understanding of the object. There had to be some familiarity with the language. For example, all of CBER students had to study a language. I studied the Yoruba language for 3 years before I went to Nigeria. Of course, I was limited in the way that I could use it. I'm not a native speaker. It's a very difficult tonal language. So I was very much hindered. And then the version of the language that I learned was Western Yoruba language based on the Oyo Kingdom. And I ended up in Eastern Yoruba land, where even Yoruba speakers have a difficult time understanding the language. However, my understanding of Yoruba and my ability to use it in a rudimentary way allowed me entry into the community that I otherwise would not have had. Now, I really don't know how that can be expressed in the context of a museum. The research that goes into understanding the object that is presented in the museum has to depend on the understanding of language to some extent. But do you have any ideas about how that idea of understanding the language is related to museum presentation and education?
Right. Fairly recently, I was attending the Association of Art Museum Curators conference last year, last May in New York. And part of the program, we were given this pass. The last session of the conference took place at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, where we were allowed to kind of go around the museum during our our break session. So there was an exhibit that was ongoing at the time. It was titled One Egungun. It was put together by Christine Wonderluna, who recently took up the curatorship at the Cleveland Museum of Art.
Right.
In that show, what the curator achieved was, this very deep focus on the Yoruba Egungun. So she literally tracked a family that created the Egungun and danced it over a period of nearly 70 years. And in her didactic, she had displayed both the interpretation and the original language of the family that created and used this material. And she went on to also interview local scholars and local historians about
You mean Nigerian locals?
In Nigeria, yes. So she got clips of interview that she conducted with Professor Dele Laiwola, for instance, and got transcript of interviews that was, were conducted by different Yoruba practitioners. And then there were ways that she put all these things within that museum setting to help. So for those who can read the Yoruba language, there's a big panel that kind of stands side by side with the English translation. I thought this was really very rich, and I think Christine's situation has been really very, very, very problematic right from the beginning. When she was appointed to curate the collection at Brooklyn Museum, was almost the same time that the movie Black Panther came out, and there was this heated argument about why she should be given the position rather than an actual African or an African American being in charge of that. That led to Professor Chika Okeke Agulu to even come on national television to defend that if you are trained, just as Christine was trained at Princeton, that he doesn't see why she cannot do the job. Yeah, so these are some of the things, and this also kind of go a long way to show some of the things that some museums are kind of grappling with. One is interpretation of this material. Two, especially what you have pointed at, there is no way that the museum can take on board the advice that was given by Abiodun a couple years ago. But I think what maybe I'm asking is that it looks as if we are getting to the point where a balance kind of is being struck. At the end of February, I was attending a museum, a concept workshop at the Clark Institute in Williamston, Massachusetts, where we were brainstorming about the installation, the reinstallation of the Michael Rockefeller wing of the Metropolitan Museum. And part of the scholars that were brought together are actually from South America, especially those dealing with art of Oceania and Latin America and the Pacific. It was actually an opportunity to bring specialists from these various areas. I think one that came from Africa was the director of the museum in Mali, where he was speaking to us about Museum Without Walls and so forth and so on. So I feel that I don't know if we are doing much to leave that experience of kind of bringing the voice more of the people that created this material into the objects themselves or not.
Yeah, two things came to mind while you were talking about that. You talked about the exhibition at Brooklyn Museum about Egungun. A couple of decades ago, Roslyn Walker at the National Museum of African Art at the Smithsonian did an exhibition on the work of a very famous Nigerian carver, sculptor by the name of Olowe of Ise. And in her research on Olowe of Ise, she depended very much on the praise poems called Oriki that were a part of Yoruba culture at that period of time. And she was able to find members of Olowe's family who could recite and sing the praise poems about him. So in the exhibition, and I guess you could say that that would be the first one-man exhibition by a traditional African artist shown in the United States, maybe in the world. But she was able to use portions of those oriki, the original Yoruba, juxtaposed to the English translation, so that we could better understand how he was perceived in the culture that he created objects for. And I can remember parts of his oriki talked about, the artist who could carve the hardwood of the Iroko tree, which is hard like oak is in this country, as if it were butter. So there were all sorts of of word images that were able to be juxtaposed to the images or the actual objects that he had created. So that was one way that language could be introduced into an exhibition. Another exhibition that comes to mind was one that Susan Vogel did at Yale and at the Museum for African Art in New York. And that exhibition was one that presented ballet sculpture from Ivory Coast, but she did it with a ballet individual, so that every object that was discussed in the exhibition was discussed from her point of view, which was a Western point of view, and from his point of view, which was a ballet point of view. So even though his portion of the exhibition was in the English language, it was through the mind of a local person who understood the object from the point of view of the community. And although Susan Vogel had worked for several decades in those communities, she still was an outsider. So she realized that giving voice to the local individual and making that voice equal to her voice was something that would be very important. A thing that, and of course, you're not always, I mean, how many objects do you have in the collection at the New Orleans Museum, the African collection? Any idea?
Yes, we have a little over 1,000, so we are getting closer to 1,100 now.
Okay, so 1,000 different objects that probably come from great numbers of different cultures. Mm-hmm. And most of those cultures will not have trained art historians or anthropologists like we do for Igbo, mm-hmm. Or for Yoruba, yeah, or for Akan, and so on. So how are we going to give voice to those things? One way is that we can use their terminology. So instead of saying that this is a bell, if it's a Yoruba bell, we could identify it as an igogo, and then in parentheses, put bell. So that gives voice to their language and how they identify the object. In identifying a masquerade, we should give the name that they use for the masquerade. You talked about the exhibition at Brooklyn. We all know that masquerade was an egungun, and we accept that term egungun as a type of Yoruba masquerade, as differentiated from Yoruba masquerades known as Ekpa, Yoruba masquerades known as Gelede, Yoruba masquerades that go by other names, and so on. So those are very subtle ways that we can introduce the language. Another thing that we have to remember is that when art historians go into African communities to do their research, they're not just looking at object and making up the story. They are using local people as their teachers. So when I was studying in Owo, Nigeria, I considered any number of people to be my teachers. My first few weeks there, I sat down with a man by the name of Justice Akeredolu, who had been one of the early museum persons in Nigeria and had studied museum work in Europe in order to help with the establishment of museums in Nigeria. So I got his point of view and his direction. I sat down with a man by the name of, he was Chief Ashara, who had been the traditional historian in the court of the king of the kingdom where I worked. And he gave me his point of view of the history of Owo and identified for me any number of chiefly families and positions of authority in the community, so that then I could go and find out their information and how they used art within their particular situations and so on. And then each one of those became my teacher in telling me about his chieftaincy and his family, the history of his chieftaincy, which king was reigning at the period that the chieftaincy was created, what the art objects were that chieftaincy made use of. So, you know, these are things that are not obvious when, say, I write an article on a particular type of object from that area, but it's something where the local voice is there because it was local people who explained to me what the object meant, when it was created, why it was created, how it was used, what it meant, how it linked to leadership, how it linked to religion, how it linked to education, all of those things that were important about understanding a particular object. There was no way that I could get it without the use of the local voice. Now, we have changed our terminology about identifying those local voices. In the distant past, the Western researcher just went in and gave sort of a summary overview of what they were able to discover. I think eventually there were those who began to refer to those people who gave them information as informants. I think the tendency now is to refer to them as colleagues or to refer to them as teachers, because they definitely do take on the role. They're not merely informing. That suggests that we're in control and that they're informing us of the things that we are asking of them. But the way I see it is that I went in as an ignorant student and they became my teachers about their culture, about their history, about the way that art worked in the context of their history, and so on. So those are ways that language plays, and you know, it's not going to be something that's readily obvious in a museum setting, but they are important. I think another thing that maybe Roland Abiodun was getting at was that a person who has great facility in using the local language is going to be able to understand the things that are being said and to understand which things are important and which things are less important. And actually, Roland grew up in the kingdom where I did my research. So his understanding of things there, if he were focusing entirely on the culture of the Owo kingdom and the Owo people, his understanding would be much greater than mine. Mine is superficial in comparison. However, as I said earlier, not every art producing culture on the continent of Africa has a local person who is trained as an art historian or as a critic or as a historian or as an anthropologist to interpret these sorts of things for people elsewhere in the world. And I think that's one of the most important roles that we play in the study of art history and in museums, is that we are trying to introduce these important concepts of visual arts to a large audience that includes the people of New Orleans, the people of Louisiana, the people of the United States. And we can not always bring in a Bamana art historian to talk about a Chihuahua. We can't even afford to bring in a Bamana artist to talk about the creation of a Chihuahua. Very often the things that we're looking at that are in collections that were begun in the 19th and early 20th century, those objects are no longer being used. They're no longer being produced. They might be being produced as souvenirs. Essentially, some people would refer to them as fakes. I don't necessarily think of them as fakes unless there's a great deal of manipulation of patina and so on to make them look old and used. So there's a wide range of those types of forms that are used as well. But we can always bring someone from that community where an object was created into the museum to interpret it for us and for our viewers. So recently, I was thinking in terms of the way that Nigerian art historians have enriched our study of art history for the continent of Africa here in the United States. And I counted up 20 Nigerian art historians who have been trained, for the most part, in a local university in Nigeria, and then coming to the United States for graduate study, and then staying in this country. So I think we're getting closer and closer to that. But there are certain African cultures that seem to be more prone to produce individuals who are interested in traditional culture and in art, who are academically prone to go into the study. There are any number of Yoruba art historians, any number of Igbo art historians. As you, I know some, I think, Ewe art historians from Ivory Coast, but although we have 20 from Nigeria that I was able to count up, almost all of them are Yoruba or Igbo. And they have played vital roles in, positions in museums in this country, as professors in this country. We just tick off person after person who, I think that's a promising thing too, is that we have those individuals who are entirely comfortable in using their mother tongue to interpret objects from their regions, or who are familiar enough with other languages close to their region that they're able to look at others. You're a case in point. You are, I guess, genetically Igbo. Mm-hmm. However, you were born in Yoruba territory. You're comfortable speaking Yoruba. You're comfortable speaking Igbo, which is what your parents can communicate easily in. Mm-hmm. But after you grew up for a while in Yoruba country, then you move to Benin, which is an Edo-speaking area. So you're able to understand the Edo language. So someone like you are able to look at Yoruba objects and understand what people are saying in Yoruba. You're able to look at Benin objects and understand what they're saying in Edo or Bini. You're able to look at Igbo objects and understand what's being said in Igbo languages. You know, I would never be able to do that. You know,
yeah, I know.
we Americans, we attempt languages, but we're not really good at it. We've been isolated for too many centuries here. So although I've studied French and German and Latin and Yoruba, I don't consider myself to be fluent in any of them.
Wow.
I can play at them. I can read French. I can read German. I can go to the market with Yoruba. I can make myself understood if necessary in Yoruba, but there's no way that I can understand it like someone like Roland Abiodun or Babatunde Lawal or Bolaji Campbell and so on.
Right.
And I would not attempt even of trying to look at Igbo.
But you know, so coincidentally, some of those Igbo scholars, I believe, were part of your colleagues when you guys were at Indiana. Names like Chike and Nyako, and Nyako probably also passed through Siber, I believe. Although he was there like in the 80s or maybe 70s or 80s, I'm not sure.
Well, when I was a student, Okechukwu Odita was there, and his son is now a very famous artist in this country.
Donald, yeah.
Donald Odita. Babatunde Lawal and I started graduate school on the very same day. And then he hosted me when I first arrived in Nigeria and nursed me through malaria and so on. And then Cornelius Adepegba was there. So there are always a few Africans who are in the major graduate programs. So, it's very promising that way.
Right. Well, we are really kind of being a little bit now compact with time. I'm sure. I don't know if this part is going to be recorded, but I hope it is able to record. And this is one of the most exciting part of our conversation this morning. I would like to hear your response about it, because when I was giving the introduction this morning, I had told us that your present focus is on the relationship between Arts of Africa and those in diaspora, especially in the American South. A significant component of your work speak to that Yoruba concept of the Ako, which is it? I may not pronounce it very correctly, but I know it's AKO. And it is the concept of the second burial right. And I will be very, we will be very interested to know or to hear that, that burial rights, and then look at that burial right in relationship with our cemetery culture here in New Orleans. If there is anything you have to tell us about that, because I'm so much interested to know that, to see if there are any connections, or even to just give our audience, this whole exciting aspect of Yoruba culture, which is that second burial right, and this fantastic Nola cemetery culture.
Okay, I would say that I would see more parallels between Congo, that's Kongo culture, and New Orleans culture as far as a cemetery is concerned. Among the Yoruba, there were a variety of different types of burial that had to do with a person's age when they died, that had to do with their family connections, that had to do with their status within the community, that had to do with whether they were a high chief or the mother of a high chief. And Ako was a sort of the ultimate burial, and it would only done for kings, very high chiefs, or the mothers of those chiefs and kings. And in that particular burial, an effigy figure was carved to represent the dead person. And then that figure was displayed and carried through the community to certain ritual places. Some were sung to it. It stopped at various ritual spots along the way. And essentially it was like a life-size that could be moved and so on. And then at the end of the Ako burial, or the Ako celebration, it would actually be buried as the individual. So it was a temporary art form. You had a piece of sculpture, but then it was buried as if it were the corpse. I don't think that we find that type of thing in the United States. And in the Yoruba culture, traditionally in the deep past, before there were cemeteries, an important individual would be buried in a place in their home, which would essentially become a shrine. And then members of the family would go to that shrine. Now that's a different thing. It's not Ako, it's the shrine where the ancestor is buried is known as an ojukbo, which actually means the face. Oju is the word for eye or the word for face. So, and then the ojukbo, it depends whether it's Ebo or Ibo. That has to do with worship on the one hand, or veneration. So it means the face or the eye of veneration. And then the family gathers there every year for an anniversary celebration of the forebears. Usually at least 3 generations of ancestors, the father, the grandfather, the great-grandfather, will be honored with music, with food, with offerings and so on. And there will be essentially the burial site of that first ancestor becomes essentially like a gallery. There will be a retableau on the altar that represents the chieftaincy and various elements such as sacrifices of cows or rams. There might be prestige symbols on it, such as horses and cattle, and then representations of people in chiefly dress and so on. So there will also be heads that might be carved wooden representations of humans, but with ram's horns, or representations of rams, and a variety of art forms. There will be lintels and posts and things that are carved. Sometimes there will be clay bas-relief to decorate these. But they're used at times when the ancestor is being celebrated, when prayers are being offered to the ancestors of the past and so on. Now, in the Congo region of Central Africa, most people were buried in cemeteries. And in the cemeteries, there were little carvings that might be made of wood. They might be made of stone, that would be sort of symbolic representations of the deceased that would be put on the grave. But there would be other things that belonged to the deceased, maybe dishes, prestige dishes like imported china bowls and glass bottles and china plates and things like that would be placed on the grave, and then the grave itself was a part of a larger cemetery. So that entire place, that entire location was a place of continued commemoration and contact with those of the past. And I think that has more in keeping with ideas of cemeteries of people of African descent in this country, where they might be decorated with little gifts. They might be decorated with things that are reminiscent of the individual, where people can go and pay their respects to the deceased and maybe communicate with the deceased. And there are any number of older cemeteries in this country, especially in the South, where there seems to be a direct correlation between the way those places become sites of communication and places for continued communication, sites for venerating the memory of the deceased, that would be more in keeping with, say, Central African cultures.
No more image, no more voice.